Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started here tonight. Thank you for joining us. This is LaRouche PAC Strategic Update for Monday, December the 6th. And we want to welcome you all to tonight's discussion. I'll be joined in the discussion with Michael Steger. My name is Keisha Rogers, and I'm here in Houston, Texas. And we got a very important dialogue and discussion for you tonight, and look forward to your contributions and your questions afterwards. Before I turn it over to Michael to give us his opening remarks, I just want to highlight just a couple of points to where we are, what the central theme of tonight's discussion is going to be. We've titled it Republic or Totalitarianism, What is True Freedom? And I think it's very appropriate for what we see unfolding in our nation today in the battle for our republic over a fascist globalist agenda that seeks to keep people enslaved and controlled to a totalitarian state. And we want to define this, and we've actually been defining this very clearly for those of you who have taken the time over the recent weeks to read a series by Bob Ingram that he's put out, going after the British Austrian School of Economics, von Hayek, and institutions that subscribe to this philosophy, such as the Hillsdale College. And I know a lot of people have had to scratch their heads on a lot of what Bob has put out, but it's very important that we understand that as we're going into the need for every American citizen to start to understand that we cannot continue to talk about talking points, catchphrases, bullet points, want our freedoms, our individual liberties, our rights, and so forth, but not knowing what that truly means in the concept of how our republic was founded, how the ideas and of the principles of our Constitution, of our Declaration of Independence, shape at the very center of our economic policies, the American system of economics, which Bob very clearly detailed in his 7-part series on not just what the enemy is and why you have been misled in your conception of understanding what a true republic is, but also the question of how we build our way out of this crisis. And we're going to be talking about that a lot further tonight. The last article in the series was titled Abraham Lincoln Conquers Inflation, which is very important. I know there's a lot of discussion going on right now. There's various podcast discussions. There's various talks on social media, on Twitter Spaces about how are we going to take our nation back? How are we going to win in 2022? Without these defining economic solutions of what is a true American system, without rejecting the globalist totalitarian agenda of fascism, which we see going on right now with the continued mandates of a Hitler-style healthcare policy guided by a the COVID operations that are going on with the Biden administration to keep everything on lockdown. And I know Michael's going to go through this very extensively tonight and how this has really devastated our nation, but nations around the world. So last thing I want to point out before I turn it over to Michael is that on the website, we have a new LaRouche PAC news shorts, and we highlight 2 areas that people should be very much concerned about and looking at, which I've just stated here. Well, the first one is titled War Clouds Over Ukraine, ? They're all British and US created, not Russia, which is very important because a lot of people have been bamboozled into believing that Russia is our enemy. We talk about a new article in Washington Post, which we'll go through shortly here, that is talking about Russia putting troops on the Ukraine border, and what tomorrow there's going to be a meeting. We'll see what's going to happen with that. I'm sure Michael will have some thoughts as to what's going to happen with the Biden-Putin meeting on the Ukraine crisis and much more. And lastly, we'll talk again, as I said, about the Omicron mandates and therapeutics, and what's the latest whole operation in the COVID fiasco. So with that, that gives you a lot on what we're going to discuss tonight. And I want to turn it over to Michael, because I think we're at a very challenging period for our nation and for the world right now. And it's going to be depending on what we do to address the crisis at hand.
Great, thanks, Keisha.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think that the discussion tonight may be a little bit more conceptual than a broad political overview, partly because, I mean, in some sense, you come to realize that if you're in war and there's been a war declared upon you, then you don't necessarily you don't need to analyze as much why there is a war. You've got to start to define how you win it. You know, we as an organization, me as a person, as an organizer working with Lynn, with Keisha, you know, we spent the last 20 years, Keisha and I and some of our colleagues who stuck with the fight, trying to wake up the American population. Now, it was in the context specifically of 9/11. That's undeniable in terms of our organizing and the approach Lyndon LaRouche took. And there's a reason, because there are two main bases or premises, predicates, by which the enemy justifies increased kind of, or you could say, totalitarian control. You know, emergency decrees, as they called it, Notverordnung in Germany, with the rise of Hitler and fascism there. It's war, and it's public health crises. And there have been studies done, sociological studies done, to show that when you have public health crises, the authoritarian tendencies of a society go up. The enemy knows it. It's been true throughout the course of history. We talked last week about ancient Athens, which had a severe plague in the context of the Peloponnesian War. You know, these kinds of things rattle and destabilize populations. People clamor for safety from both the war or the disease. And with the disease question, you get a different characteristic. Where in the war process, of course, you get concerns about enemy infiltration into your population. You can get paranoia. But on the question of public health and disease, you deal with two clear divisions. Those who are potentially unhealthy or at risk or contagious, and those who aren't. So I think all of us on this call tonight can see the parallels. So the last 20 years, we've been concerned about a war danger. It was a very real war danger. The enemy had basically deployed the United States into the Middle East aggressively, into Afghanistan, which, remember, that war was won within 2 months. We deployed at the end of September, or at the beginning of October, and we had won the war by the beginning of December. The Taliban had basically given up. But we deployed into Afghanistan and Iraq, and then Obama came in, with the expectations of getting out of the war, and he only escalated them. He escalated into one area in Ukraine, supporting a Nazi-backed coup in Ukraine. Also Libya, the war in Syria, where we used ISIS troops. Just one. I think there are others, but those are clear examples. Now, Trump's election brought in a shift. So there's all this talk. You'll get a bunch of numbskulls, including many Republicans in Congress. Probably most of the entire Republicans in the Senate will go along with this. I was told recently someone said we got to get more Republicans we got to get a Republican majority into the Congress. And Matt Gaetz had said, well, can you count on the Republican Party to really do that, to change the policy? And on this war danger question, they have real problems. But is there a danger of war? Is that the immediate concern? It's certainly not a concern if you look at the Russian situation. Russia is not planning a war. China may have interest in Taiwan, but China is not planning for some full-scale war. If anything, China is running an economic warfare where they see the United States giving up its industrial base and industrial production. Why go to war if your enemy is going to basically give up over time anyways. So the concern of war is not there today as it had been under Bush and under Obama. President Trump greatly changed that. The question today is, what are we as a civilization? Are we going to continue to commit mass suicide, massive destruction of our industrial base, or aren't we? And this COVID cult, this response, has brought in that we may have been resisting a little too much. Trump brought in too much resistance. So instead, what you have is a strong reaction, a public health crisis over an illness that really doesn't kill that many people and would probably have killed a lot less if treatments were supported. Hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, even the monoclonal antibodies, which were a brand new idea in terms of treating this illness, were restricted. It wasn't like they just defamed or mocked ivermectin. They tried to choke off the supplies in Florida where it was getting used. Doctors who prescribed it often were basically sidelined. So, but you've got this program, and it's now become totalitarian and totally cultish, where people in California are now under emergency circumstances through at least March of next year for another 4 months, or yeah, at least another 4 months. In Oregon, they're talking about mask provisions, or at least rules on masking for permanent basis. The Attorney General of New York is calling for masked people everywhere. That she thinks the current governor, who's now her opponent in a gubernatorial election, the lady that replaced Andrew Cuomo, the Attorney General, Letitia James, is saying she's not taking it seriously enough. We've got to go stronger. What de Blasio is doing in New York is now mandating illegally, massively illegally. None of these emergency decree powers were outlined in any clear basis. Much of this has been massive overreach. That's why all of Biden's mandates are losing in the courts, because no judge can see any basis for them to win. But even de Blasio has called for massive mandates for vaccines for everyone in New York. Not just the city employees, but everyone. And there's already been massive resistance from city employees. Now there is the internment camps or COVID camps in Australia, where if you don't follow the rules, you get $5,000 fines. And the rules, they basically have forced people into these camps. Massive lockdowns in Austria and Germany, where you're basically creating second-class citizens if you're unvaccinated. And what vaccination means, whether 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots, that goalpost will certainly be changing if it hasn't already in some of these locations. These politicians never plan on giving up power. And in New York or in California or Oregon or Washington, in places that are solidly Democrat controlled at the state government, executive, state legislative, and then through the major cities and major counties. The counties have taken huge control. This is true in Oakland County in Michigan. They never plan on pulling back these emergency situation. There's no reason to think that they would decide to pull them back and get back to normal. Now, when you've got a doddering, senile old fart in the White House who's mangling what is already a massively disrupted economy, they're not going to give up these powers, because you're going to see an increasingly building backlash against their program, especially as it significantly fails. So we're at we've reached a turning point. Now, this is not new. I'm not expecting anyone to think that this idea that these politicians don't want to hand back this power is a new concept. I just want to make it definitively clear that they continue to implement extreme measures when every indication, there is no major Omicron crisis in South Africa or Botswana. Certainly not in the other nations we did a no-fly list to. The economic lockdowns were not only a disaster for the United States and for small businesses, it has nothing to do with monetary profits. What we've seen in this dynamic has been a complete backing of the global corporations with all the credit, all of the market supply, and those people who are trying to set up small businesses, create competition for big businesses, run small restaurants or other entities where you're dependent on lines of credit that were already shrinking. You were mangled. You've been destroyed. And so you're seeing increased mental health issues. You see this in the case in Oxford, Michigan, with this young man who went nuts without any parental engagement in the problem, from what we can tell. But this is true amongst our entire generation. Young people's suicides have been up. Mental health has been a growing problem over the last 20 years, if not longer, in this country. The opioid crisis. That's in the industrialized world. Imagine what's happening in these places where there is no major Omicron breakout, but you've just shut down any air travel. You've kind of made them a pariah of the global community. Not the fascist policies in these governments, whether it's New York or Germany, Austria, or Australia, or Canada, where they're actually restricting and dominating people's behaviors, deciding who gets medical care and who doesn't. But also, when they continue to shut down power supply, who gets energy and who doesn't. That's the same policy that's been done to this developing sector in Africa or South America or South Asia for many years. They've been fighting against that tendency for quite some time. So to say this is about mankind, this is about humanity, we've all got to take these measures, is such bold hypocrisy that we have to just kind of take a step back and say, okay, a war has been declared. How do we define winning this? Now, I presented what I did, not because there aren't other elements politically happening, but I think this is the most important question. What comes up in many responses of many people all over the world is, we want freedom. We want liberty. We want a free society. And that's an understandable response. It's an inalienable right and concept that exists within the minds of human beings. Animals don't have that idea. Animals don't think when they're in a pen, I want to be free, per se. They may want to stretch their legs more, but I wouldn't say that's not what we mean by freedom. I mean, you could stretch your legs in a concentration camp. So, what does freedom mean? What do we mean by freedom? And you have to consider the fact that this is not a war. This is not a war that was launched 2 years ago with COVID. It wasn't a war launched in 2016 with the attempted CIA and FBI coup against Trump. It wasn't a war even launched by 9/11. I mean, a fascist movement where corporations and government work in concerted effort to control and reduce population was certainly 100 years in the process. It wouldn't be a stretch to say Napoleon and Bonaparte was a fascist. And the war on the United States is certainly, culturally, on these questions of what does freedom mean to the people of the United States who defined a free nation, has been an ongoing process for 120 years. I raise that because it then becomes obvious, if you're the enemy of the United States, if you're the enemy of free people, if you have the interest in controlling populations' behavior, size, and activity, if you believe that's your basis of existence in political control and rule, you will look to control the concepts and the language and the meaning of that language within the populations you intend to control. And so what do we mean by freedom? What is the necessary concept of freedom that we can then offer a viable alternative to people, not just who are demanding it today, but those who will come to realize that this cult is a failure, that it cannot provide even the promises it makes. It never has, it never will. Hitler couldn't fulfill the promises. Mussolini might be able to make the trains run on time, but for a short period of time. Much like the money printing schemes of the last 20 years have kind of kept people thinking maybe the economy and stock market are fine, when we all ultimately know for the time being that might work. But you're papering, literally papering over a massive growing wound in the economy of our country and much of the world. Well, from my reflection, I would start on the question of freedom back to Plato's reflections after the Peloponnesian War. That kind of picks up where we left off last week in terms of opening comments. But there's an often referenced dialogue, and it's the Meno dialogue. And in it, Plato gets, and Ian Overton, Keisha's husband, recently presented this. I'm going to go through it very quickly. He presented the question of doubling a square. Socrates asks a slave boy if he can double a square, and then works him through the discovery. There's a profound notion there. Why? Well, let me ask you this. If I define freedom as the ability to have infinite choices in what you wanted to do and how you lived, would you consider that freedom? Infinite. An uncountable number of options of how you lived. Would you consider that to be freedom? Now, some of you may think this is a trick question, so no. But it sounds relatively appealing. It seems like it could be sufficient. Infinite choices. Well, what Socrates proved in that case to that young so-called slave boy was that you can still have infinite choices, and we can deprive you of the most important one. Because that length, the length of the square root of 2, is not anywhere within normal numbers or fractions. There's no fraction, there's no relationship between two numbers that give the square root of 2. We all learned it in school. It's an irrational number. Irrational because the decimal point numbers go on infinitely. So if I give you infinite choices, I could give you all possible fractions as an example of infinite options, all possible fractions, all possible numbers, and all their relationships to each other as options, and I could still deprive you of the square root of 2. Now, this is a concept which our enemy doesn't teach in mathematics anymore, this idea. They even attacked the person who formulated it in clear terms. It was a guy named Georg Cantor. He called it a very cool idea. He called it transfinite numbers, meaning that there were going to be sets like fractions and real counting numbers as one set of numbers. But there was a whole other set, and that could be infinite. It would be an infinite set of choices, but there were still higher powers. So you think of the quality of education or notion of freedom, and you think, if I had infinite choices, that would still not be enough. Well, this is the problem with, and why Bob Ingram's articles on von Hayek are provocative. Because there's an assumption of freedom or liberty, or what Adam Smith presents. This kind of cosmopolitan view that diversity or the division of labor, these kinds of things are economic growth, improved powers of labor. And that freedom is to choose what's in your interest and not what's not in your interest. But what if the choices are predefined? What if you can choose, but you can choose within these sets? That's exactly what they've been doing for 50 years in the United States. They've made a fascist economic program a choice between what flavor of fascist economic policy. How do you want to lower your population levels? Do you want to do it through war, or do you want to do it through shutting down energy, or do you want to do it by increasing your illicit drug supply? Do you want to shut down your infrastructure? Do you want to extend your work hours? Do you want to break down the family? Which version of decay do you want to choose? And so what we have to consider is that the options, the means by which we're going to create a free society, is to be able to conceptually identify that which is beyond what we've been given access to for 50 years or longer. That means it's something we aren't quite familiar with. We don't know it. There was something kind of where I wanted to go, or at least something I wanted to comment on. So, I mean, I think the main question, and I can maybe wrap up and see what discussion we have, is that this quality of considering what's beyond what's been provided to us, that simply a choices or an ability to think we're choosing our own pathway is sufficient. And I think what comes back to this then, and this is something LaRouche would reference in terms of this idea, this transfinite idea. He would reference it as an ontological transfinite, meaning something coming from the top ordering, coming from God's creation, starting with God's creation, and then working your way downward. Is that, where does mankind have to go? What do we have to accomplish? That's really the question of where freedom would exist. The ability to do that which is most necessary. And this is something where freedom doesn't seem to have that implicit question. It seems to be freedom is a question of choices among many different things. Where the real freedom, and for someone who's been put in a very tough situation, if you're lost in the woods, the freedom is, can you do what's necessary? Can you get out? Can you identify where you are or get back to base camp? The freedom is not to have infinite choices. Infinite choices can sometimes be the worst situation. What you're looking for is the clearest perspective. How do we get out of this crisis? This is why LaRouche and what LaRouche PAC have put so much emphasis on Keisha's campaigns and the space program. Because sometimes it's finding a singular pathway as your most clear example of what freedom represents. The freedom to advance, the freedom to grow, is a gift we give to future generations because we were able to identify the necessary pathway that could be taken. It isn't simply to stop the mandates, stop the ability to socially control us. And in some ways, whether it's Madison Avenue in marketing or advertising or social media or social opinion, popular opinion is always going to be there, and it's probably always going to be wrong. It's always going to be out there. But can we, at critical moments, respond to leadership and to ideas, and can we individually, us, you, foster ideas that actually recognize there's a singular pathway out of this? There's a strategic approach that we can take to solve the crisis. And so that's kind of brings us back to the discussion last week, that the strategic perspective, what Washington had, he saw in his choice of freedom, was to say we're going to build a nation, a clear nation, a concept that had yet existed. We're going to fortify a union of the states in ways that can then establish a beachhead, a bulwark against this imperial program. That we're going to recognize that human beings are not really here simply to enjoy their individual pleasures. that we want something different. Now, in that idea, and I'll wrap up on this point and then see what people think, in this kind of exploring what the notion of freedom is, we get into something that where the enemy has had dominant control for far too long. And that is on the aesthetic question, or you could otherwise put it, what is beauty? Or, and even in cases, what is entertaining or engaging? The famous poet Keats, beauty is truth and truth beauty, that the question of what's true, there was the famous playwright Friedrich Schiller, the highest form of art is true political freedom. That political freedom is the most beautiful question, is the most beautiful expressions of human social creation. It's a provocative idea. Political freedom is the most beautiful creation of human social development. Well, how do we then think of something beautiful? This question, this kind of transfinite question, because it's not simply you have one set here and one set there, they're higher ordered. Like if there was, start from the creator himself to his creation and then other expressions of it. It's a vertically ordered process. Well, there are things which are more beautiful. How do we measure that? How do we measure that which is more beautiful? It's not simply in the eye of the beholder. I mean, it is, right? If you have a society that's dumbed down and willing to accept slavery, their sense of beauty is going to be dumbed down and enslaved. What they think is beautiful or aesthetically appropriate, how they measure truth, is going to be affected. But if we're going to declare victory, if we're going to demand victory in this war, then it's a different question. Then is, well, how are we going to then now redevelop a sense of beauty? This cultural domain is one of the most critical facets of the war we're fighting. It gives people room to think. It recruits people out of the din of this dark kind of cult behavior that they're submitting to. Sometimes that which is beautiful is the most compelling way out of these kinds of crises. It's what organizing is, right? When you're organizing, you're looking to activate the imagination of the person you're talking to. I would say that this is the kind of question that people like Bach or Mozart or Beethoven had on their mind. They recognized that if we're going to create a sense of freedom within these regimes at that time, and Beethoven faced it perhaps as severely as any of them. He saw the hard shutdown after the 1850 Congress of Vienna and after Napoleon's wars. That they said, how do we break people from this enslaved question of what's truly beautiful and what's really truthful? How do we broaden people's sense of what's possible? Because that's the idea, right? You're only going to be able to have a population respond to something necessary where true freedom lies if they actually have the ability to more broadly think about the possibilities within their own mind. This is what these great composers were thinking. It's what great artists, whether it's, I really like Bruegel's work, really challenges in playful or very, very striking ways the population of Europe at the time and their stupidity and rituals and habits, or Rembrandt's remarkable paintings. But there's something about the aesthetic versus today, people, like churches, try to recruit to their church or even to political events by having disco balls, smoke machines, and laser lights. So we've adopted the techniques of a 1970s disco to try to bring people into more profound discussion. It's only one very clear example that we give up, we concede to the enemy certain fundamental concepts and ideas right off the bat, right at the very beginning. They would love to have freedom or liberty be, you don't have to deal with mandates, as long as it means you just have to kind of survive on your own. We're not going to act as a nation. We're not going to advance and build the nation in profoundly new ways, by a permanent base on the moon, by fusion technology, by advanced manufacturing. People have accepted the idea we're never going to bring industry and manufacturing back to the United States. So, but I can still be free even if we don't do that. Can you? Can you be a free American and give up all of your manufacturing and industry? The founding fathers thought absolutely not. That you can't do that. But perhaps in our imagination today, in the imagination of the American people today, we've lost a sense of why that's so important. So I think our role as organizers today is to get out and challenge at the fundamental question, what are we going to accomplish? What are we going to create? Not because we have to know for certain. Yes, the space program fusion, LaRouche PAC clearly identifies that as the core strategic footholds. If we create those, we could rapidly rebuild US industry and manufacturing. And there's many reasons why. Brian Lance covered that on Saturday and will continue to cover it in the coming Saturdays. But there are questions that I think we have to get into these meetings, into this grassroots ferment, into this revolt against this insanity, which has become so blatant and obvious. And to start really asking people to engage in, well, what are we going to create? What do we mean by freedom? It's not something you can answer directly, much like a Socratic dialogue. It is in the process of engaging in that quality of discussion. What really is the pathway out of this crisis? The free society is a society that will naturally choose that which is most necessary for their long-term survival. And I think that's what we want to continue to create and shape as a discussion process. So hopefully that's useful. I'm going to leave my comments there just because I'm more interested in hearing what you have to say, and we'll go from there.